My family laughed at my inheritance, calling it a worthless mud pit. The day I returned from my grandfather's funeral, someone handed me an envelope containing his will. I thought maybe I'd inherit his old harmonica or a photo album at best. But no, he left me a swamp, a plot in the Atchafalaya Basin, complete with mosquitoes the size of your fist, alligators, and a smell like a rotting boat that's been baking in the sun for a month. There I was, standing in my only decent clothes, a cheap suit I bought at Goodwill specifically for the funeral, staring at a deed to 50 acres of Louisiana wetland that nobody in their right mind would want. 50 acres of mud, cypress trees, and creatures that would probably enjoy making a meal out of me. Let me back up a bit. My name's Clay Thibodeau. I had barely 7 years with my parents before I lost them. They died in a car crash when I was a kid. A semi-truck driver fell asleep at the wheel on I-10, and that was that. 1 minute I had a family. The next I was shipped off to live with the Mackenzies, who took me in for the foster care checks more than anything else. The only real family I had left was my grandfather, Gerald, my dad's father. He was an old petroleum engineer who'd retired early and lived in a double-wide trailer at the edge of the swamp. The Mackenzies would drop me off at his place whenever they wanted a break, which was fine by me. Those were the only times I felt like I could breathe. Grandpa Gerald taught me things that actually mattered: how to survive in the swamps, catch crawfish, make a proper gumbo that would make your taste buds stand up and salute. He'd tell me old Creole stories about the rougarou, the Louisiana werewolf, while we sat on his rickety porch, fireflies dancing in the humid night air. I worked at Hank's auto shop after school, saving every dollar I could. By the time I graduated high school, I had about $3,000 tucked away for technical college. I wanted to be a mechanic, maybe even open my own shop someday. Something solid and real, where I could work with my hands and fix things that were broken. The Mackenzies never knew about my savings. Tom Mackenzie would have found a way to make me contribute it to the household if he'd known. I kept the money in a bank account Grandpa Gerald helped me set up when I turned 16. When I was little, I used to cry myself to sleep thinking about my parents. The Mackenzies never noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. But Grandpa Gerald always knew when I'd had a rough night. He'd look at my red eyes in the morning and say, "The strongest trees grow from the deepest pain. Boy, your roots are growing deeper every day." At the funeral, the Mackenzies couldn't even pretend to be respectful. Tom's wife, Brenda, was wearing a bright floral dress like she was headed to a barbecue, not a funeral. Their biological kids were playing games on their phones during the service. When the lawyer mentioned the swampland inheritance after the ceremony, Brenda let out a laugh that sounded like a goose being strangled. "He might as well have left you a frog in an aquarium. Would have been more useful," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Maybe you can sell that worthless mud pit to some developer who doesn't know any better." I just nodded and said nothing. Grandpa had taught me that sometimes silence is the best response to disrespect. But inside, something was shifting. This land, this worthless mud pit, was the last that my grandfather had given me. And somehow, that made it precious. The real trouble started when we got back to the Mackenzies' house. I never could call it home, even after 12 years living there. Tom cornered me in the kitchen while I was making myself a sandwich. "So about that swamp," he started, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "I've been thinking. You sell that land, and you give half to us. Fair's fair. We fed and housed you for 12 years. I almost laughed. Fed me? I've been making my own meals since I was 10. Housed me? I slept on a pull-out couch in their basement that smelled like mildew and cat pee. And I've been paying them rent from my auto shop paycheck since I was 16. It's my inheritance," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Grandpa Gerald wanted me to have it. Tom's face turned the color of boiled crawfish. "You ungrateful brat. After everything we've done for you, the state checks barely covered your expenses, and now you're sitting on potentially valuable property and won't help the people who raised you." "Raise me?" The words came out before I could stop them. "You didn't raise me. You tolerated me for the checks. Grandpa Gerald raised me. I should have seen what was coming next, but somehow I didn't. Maybe part of me still wanted to believe the Mackenzies had some decency buried deep down. That night, I came home from my shift at the auto shop to find my duffel bag and backpack sitting on the front porch. Tom was waiting by the door, arms crossed. "You're 18 now, legal adult. We're not obligated to keep you anymore," he said flatly. "Take your stuff and get out." I stood there in the warm Louisiana evening, crickets chirping all around us like nothing was happening, like my world wasn't falling apart all over again. Where am I supposed to go? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Tom shrugged. "Not my problem. Maybe your precious swamp has a nice cozy mud hole for you." I picked up my bags, everything I own in the world fitting into 2 pieces of luggage. 12 years with the Mackenzies. And this was how it ended, on the porch, with the door literally shut in my face. That night, I slept in my car parked outside Hank's auto shop. The next morning, I washed up in the bathroom, changed into my work clothes, and started my shift like nothing had happened. Hank noticed something was off, but he didn't pry. That's one thing I always appreciated about him. During my lunch break, I called the lawyer who'd handled Grandpa's will. "Mr. Thibodeau, yes. Your grandfather's trailer is part of the property he left you. The deed's all squared away. So, technically, you can move in whenever you want." I nearly dropped the phone. I had no idea Grandpa had left me the trailer, too. The lawyer hadn't mentioned that part of the funeral. Maybe because the Mackenzies were hovering around like vultures. "There's electricity and running water," the lawyer continued, "though I should warn you it's rustic. Mr. Thibodeau wasn't much for modern conveniences." That was an understatement. Grandpa's idea of luxury was a ceiling fan that didn't make a clicking sound when it turned. After my shift ended, I drove out to the swamp. To my swamp, I guess. The sun was setting as I pulled up to Grandpa's trailer, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the still water of the bayou. The trailer looked smaller than I remembered and more weathered, paint peeling off the sides, a few shingles missing from the roof. But it was mine, the first place that had ever truly been mine. I unlocked the door with the key the lawyer had given me. Inside, everything was exactly as Grandpa had left it. His old recliner still had the impression of his body. His fishing rod stood in the corner. The air smelled like him, a mixture of tobacco, Old Spice, and something uniquely Grandpa Gerald that I couldn't name. I sat down in his recliner, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself cry. Not the silent tears I trained myself to shed at the Mackenzies, but deep, rag sobs that came from somewhere primitive inside me. The kind of crying that leaves you feeling hollowed out, but somehow cleaner. Later that night, I sat on the porch with a bottle of beer I'd found in Grandpa's fridge. Probably not good anymore, but I didn't care. The sound of the swamp surrounded me. Frogs croaking, insects buzzing, the occasional splash of something in the water. In the distance, I could hear faint Cajun music floating over from Tom Marie's bar and grill about a mile down the road. The air was thick with humidity, but there was a slight breeze that made it bearable. Fireflies blinked on and off among the cypress trees, like the stars had fallen down to dance among the Spanish moss. I thought about Hurricane Katrina and how it had changed this region forever. I was just a kid when it hit, but I remember the chaos, the displacement. Grandpa's place had been lucky, high enough to avoid the worst flooding, sturdy enough to withstand the winds. "Built this place to last," he'd say, patting the wall of his trailer with affection, like a Thibodeau should. That first night in the trailer, I barely slept. The swamp is never quiet, not like you'd expect. It's alive with sounds, some recognizable, others mysterious. Every creak and groan of the trailer settling made me jump at first, until I started to learn its language. Morning came with a thick blanket of fog over the water. I made coffee in Grandpa's old percolator, strong enough to strip paint, just how he liked it, and took it out to the porch. As the sun rose higher, burning off the mist, I noticed something strange. In certain spots, the ground seemed to be steaming, little wisps of vapor rising up from the earth itself. I remembered something Grandpa Gerald told me once, on a morning just like this. We were fishing for catfish, and I was complaining about the mosquitoes and the smell and the mud, that seemed to get everywhere no matter how careful you were. He looked at me with those wise old eyes of his and said, "This swamp has more power and life in it than a whole oil field, but you need the eyes to see it, and the heart to feel it." I didn't understand what he meant then. Standing on my porch, watching the earth breathe in the morning light, I wondered if maybe I was starting to. The swamp was alive in ways I'd never noticed before. And somehow, impossibly, it was mine. This worthless mud pit that no one wanted was now the only home I had in the world. As I sipped my coffee and watched the great blue heron glide silently over the water, I realized something that sent a chill up my spine, despite the growing heat of the day. Grandpa Gerald hadn't left me this land because it was worthless. He'd left it to me because it was valuable, in ways that people like the Mackenzies would never understand. I just had to figure out what those ways were. Those wisps of vapor rising from the swamp that morning fascinated me. I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's words about the swamp having more power and life than a whole oil field. At first, I thought it was just the mysterious beauty of nature he was talking about. But something about those steaming patches of earth triggered a memory. Years ago, Grandpa had shown me a documentary about renewable energy where they mentioned something called biogas. I remembered him getting unusually excited, pointing at the TV saying, "See that? That's what I've been telling them for years." As the day went on, that memory kept nagging at me. By evening, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. I grabbed my laptop and drove to the edge of town where I could catch enough cell signal to use my phone as a hotspot. I spent that entire night in my car, hunched over my laptop, burning through my data plan like there was no tomorrow. But I couldn't stop. With each article I read about biogas and methane collection, the pieces started fitting together. This wasn't just some crazy idea. It was science. Real science that people were implementing all over the world, just not here in the backwaters of Louisiana. The next morning, running on nothing but gas station coffee and excitement, I started going through Grandpa's things properly. In the corner of his bedroom stood an old sea chest that I remember from childhood. It was always locked back then, which of course made it the most fascinating thing in the world to 7-year-old me. Now, fumbling through the ring of keys the lawyer had given me, I found a small brass one that looked promising. It fit perfectly. Inside the chest were stacks of newspaper clippings from the 80s about alternative energy, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Beneath those was something even more valuable, a leather-bound journal filled with my grandfather's meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches. Turns out Grandpa Gerald wasn't just any petroleum engineer. He had worked for Gulf Oil before its merger with Chevron, developing alternative energy sources, until the company decided it wasn't profitable. His journal was filled with designs for biogas collection systems and notes on experiments he'd conducted right here on this very property. One page in particular caught my eye, in handwriting more careful than the rest, as if he wanted to make sure future generations could read it clearly. He'd written, "When oil prices soar to the heavens again, people will remember that nature creates energy on its own. And then the time for this theory will come." Below was a date, June 17th, 1986. Almost 40 years ago. The old man had been thinking about this stuff since before I was born. I sat on his bedroom floor until my legs went numb, poring over those journals. Some of the technical stuff went over my head, but the basic concept was clear enough. Decomposing organic matter, like the kind found in abundance in swamps, produces methane. Capture that methane, and you got fuel. Not exactly rocket science, but the way Grandpa had designed systems specifically adapted to the unique conditions of the Atchafalaya Basin, that was genius. With no family left and few prospects, I decided to dig deeper. In Grandpa's contacts, I found a number for someone named Dr. Williams at Louisiana State University. The area code looked ancient, but I figured it was worth a shot. To my surprise, not only was the number still working, but Dr. Williams himself answered. He was an environmental engineering professor who had worked with my grandfather decades ago. Clay Thibodeau, Gerald's grandson. His voice crackled with age but retained a sharp intelligence. "Well, how is that old swamp fox doing?" The conversation that followed was one of the hardest I'd ever had, explaining that Grandpa had passed. hearing the genuine grief in Dr. Williams' voice. But then, something shifted when I mentioned the journals. He kept them? All this time. There was a new energy in his voice. Your grandfather was a genius, son, but he was ahead of his time. Now, after Hurricane Ida, when half the state was left without power again, his ideas are more relevant than ever. Dr. Williams agreed to meet me the following week. He was in his 70s now, an African-American man with a neat white beard and eyes that missed nothing. We sat on Grandpa's porch, swatting mosquitoes and going through the journals together. See this design here? He pointed to a sketch that looked like a series of connected barrels and pipes. This is brilliant. Your grandfather figured out how to adjust the standard biogas digester design to work with the specific bacteria and vegetation found in this ecosystem. I must have looked skeptical, because he laughed. Listen, I know it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. Biogas digesters are used all over the world, especially in rural areas of developing countries. India, China, parts of Africa, places where they can't rely on a centralized power grid. The same technology could work here. That day changed everything for me. It wasn't just about honoring Grandpa's memory anymore. This was practical. This was something I could actually do. I took $1,500 of my savings, half of what I'd set aside for technical college, and ordered basic equipment. PVC pipes, valves, pressure gauges, a small engine modified to run on biogas. The rest I tried to cobble together from scrap materials I found around the property or picked up cheap at salvage yards. The Mackenzies would have called me crazy. Hell, most people would have. But as Dr. Williams put it, the greatest innovations often come from the margins, from the places and people society has written off. By day, I kept working at Hank's auto shop. By night, I was transforming into a mad scientist, guided by my grandfather's notes and whatever information I could scrounge up online at the library in town, since my phone data had long since been maxed out. My first attempts were educational, let's say, educational in the way that only spectacular failures can be. The initial setup I built exploded spectacularly, nearly setting the trailer on fire. Turns out I hadn't properly accounted for pressure regulation. I stood there, covered in swamp muck and reeking of rotten eggs, watching my hard work literally go up in smoke. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was wasting my time on nonsense, just like my grandfather who died broke. Maybe the Mackenzies' worldview, practical, mercenary, unimaginative, was a correct one after all. But then I remembered something Grandpa used to tell me when I'd wake up crying after nightmares about my parents' accident. He'd sit on the edge of my bed and say, "Pain is like a swamp, Clay. Seems dirty and scary, but if you learn to live in it, you can find amazing things." The next day, I started over. I kept a journal during this period, partly to document my experiments and partly to maintain some semblance of sanity as the only human for miles around. Reading it back now, I can see the gallows humor that kept me going. Day 14 of Operation Swamp Gas. If I blow myself up with a methane explosion, please tell future generations to beware of Cajuns with soldering irons and YouTube tutorials. And a few days later, discover that alligators are surprisingly judgmental. The one I've named Senator Mitchell watches my work every day from the bank, expression clearly saying, "This Yankee fool gonna blow himself to Mississippi." For the record, I'm not a Yankee, born and raised in Louisiana, but I swear that gator had the same disapproving look my high school principal used to give me. After several more failures, each less catastrophic than the last, I finally achieved success. One evening, as the sun was setting and the chorus of frogs was reaching its crescendo, my improvised biogas generator sputtered to life. The small engine connected to it began to hum, and then, miracle of miracles, the single light bulb hanging from the porch ceiling flickered on. I called it the holy bulb miracle. Not very original, but when you've been living by flashlight for a week because you ran out of fuel for the old generator, and your bank account is hovering dangerously close to empty, seeing electric light feels downright biblical. I just stood there on the porch, staring at that 60-watt bulb like it was the Star of Bethlehem. Insects immediately began swarming around it, but I didn't care. That light represented something bigger. It meant my grandfather wasn't crazy. It meant I wasn't crazy. It meant that sometimes the things people throw away or ignore are actually valuable. You just have to look at them differently. Over the next few weeks, I refined the system. The first setup was crude, producing just enough power for some basic lighting and to charge my phone. But each iteration got better. I expanded the collection area, improved the filtering system, adjusted the digester design based on Grandpa's notes and my own observations. It wasn't just about the technical aspects, though. I was learning to read the swamp, to notice which areas produce the most gas, how the output changed with the weather, which plant matter decomposed most efficiently. The knowledge my grandfather had accumulated over decades, I was rediscovering through trial and error. Dr. Williams visited again, bringing some testing equipment from the university lab. He measured the methane content and purity, nodding approvingly. "You got a good setup here, Clay. Small scale, but the principles are sound. With some refinement, you could power this whole property sustainably." For the first time since Grandpa died, I felt like I had a purpose, a direction. Maybe not the one I'd imagined for myself, but one that felt right nonetheless. As summer progressed, the Louisiana heat became almost unbearable. The air was thick enough to chew, and thunderstorms rolled through almost daily, turning the already soggy ground into a proper quagmire. But my little system kept working, even getting more efficient with the increased heat and moisture. I expanded from just lights to running a small refrigerator, then an old window AC unit for the bedroom. Luxury upon luxury. Soon I had more electricity than I could use myself. That's when I remembered the fishing camp about a quarter-mile down the bayou. Old man Robichaux and his wife lived there year-round in a cabin that made my trailer look like the Ritz. They'd never had electricity beyond a gas generator that frequently broke down. I spent a weekend running waterproof cables through the swamp, using the trees as natural poles. When I knocked on their door and explained what I was offering, free electricity, at least for now, while I tested my system, Mamire Robichaux nearly cried. The first thing she plugged in was a small fan that she positioned directly at her husband's easy chair. "Mon cher, you are a blessing," she told me, pressing a jar of homemade fig preserves into my hands. The good Lord works in mysterious ways. Word spread quickly after that. In rural communities, especially ones as isolated as the bayou, news travels on a current as strong as the Mississippi itself. Soon I had neighbors I didn't even know existed stopping by, curious about the swamp power they'd heard about. An elderly couple whose breathing machines required constant electricity during outages. A young family with a baby who needed refrigeration for medicine. A teenager who just wanted to charge her phone so she could apply for college scholarships online. I helped where I could, expanding my system bit by bit, learning as I went. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to power a city or even a proper town. But out here, in this forgotten corner of Louisiana, it was making a difference. One morning, about 2 months after I'd moved into the trailer, I heard vehicles approaching. Unusual for a place accessible mainly by boat. I stepped onto the porch to see an official-looking SUV with the Parish Sheriff Department logo pulling up, followed by a sedan with a parish council placard on the door. My stomach dropped. Was this about permits? Environmental regulations? Had I broken some law I didn't even know existed? Sheriff Boudreaux was a big man with a surprisingly gentle manner. I'd met him a few times when I was younger. He and Grandpa used to fish together occasionally. The woman with him introduced herself as Councilwoman Doucette from the Parish Council. "We saw lights out here at night," the sheriff began, removing his hat. "At first, we thought maybe someone was using your grandpa's old place for something illegal, like in that Breaking Bad show." I tried not to look as nervous as I felt. Surely running electrical cables through a swamp without permits was against some regulation or another. The councilwoman stepped forward. "Listen, if this isn't anything illegal, we need to talk. After the last storm, the entire southern part of the parish has been without power for 3 weeks now. And you, it seems, are the only one with lights on." She eyed the collection of tanks and pipes behind my trailer. "What exactly have you got going on here, Mr. Thibodeau?" And just like that, My little experiment was about to become much bigger than I'd ever imagined. I brewed Grandpa Gerald's special Cajun cafe au lait with chicory and milk in his old kitchen pot for Sheriff Boudreau and Councilwoman Doucette. They sat at my rickety kitchen table, glancing skeptically at the collection of pipes, tanks, and gauges visible through the window. They couldn't believe the swamp beneath us could be a source of electricity. Even less could they believe that little Clay, known around town as that poor orphan from Mrs. Johnson's class, had figured it out. "So let me get this straight," Sheriff Boudreau said, carefully setting down his mug. "You're collecting gas from the rotting plants in the swamp, filtering it, and using it to power generators?" I nodded, trying not to look too proud. "It's not complicated. The organic matter decomposes and releases methane. I'm just harvesting what's already there." He exchanged a look with Councilwoman Doucette that I couldn't quite read. "And you learned this from your grandfather's notes?" "Yes, ma'am. He was working on this decades ago, but nobody would listen." The councilwoman leaned forward, getting straight to business. "Here's the situation, Mr. Thibodeau. We got about 40 homes south of here, without power for going on 3 weeks now. The electric company says it'll be at least another 2 weeks before they can restore service. We've got elderly folks whose medication needs refrigeration, children sweating through nights with no air conditioning, and a small medical clinic running on a generator that's about to give out." I swallowed hard. What they were asking was way beyond my little experimental setup. I don't know if my system can handle all that. I admitted, it's still pretty basic. Sheriff Boudreau nodded. "We're not asking you to power the whole parish. But if you could help with some of the critical infrastructure, the medical clinic, the water tower, it would make a huge difference." I thought about it. My setup was small, but the principles were sound. With some scaling up, maybe I could do it. And Grandpa's journals had designs for larger systems that I hadn't tried yet. "I can try," I said finally. "No promises, but I'll do my best." The sheriff nodded, but I could see a practical question forming. "What about the cost? Running electrical lines isn't cheap, and you need quite a bit of equipment to scale up." It was a fair point. I'd been wondering the same thing. My savings were nearly depleted from building the initial system. There was no way I could afford to run lines to the clinic and water tower, let alone buy industrial-grade generators and transformers. Councilwoman Doucette's usual stern expression softened slightly. "The parish has emergency funds for disaster relief that we can tap into. We can cover the materials and necessary equipment." "What about Southern Electric?" I asked. "Won't they object to someone else running power lines in their territory?" "They don't have a legal leg to stand on during a declared emergency," the sheriff replied. "Besides, we've got volunteer linemen from the Electric Workers Union who've offered to help with installation. They're sitting around waiting for Southern Electric to give them work orders anyway. Might as well put their skills to use." It was like a weight lifting off my shoulders. Between the parish funds, volunteer labor, and my know-how from Grandpa's designs, what seemed impossible suddenly felt doable. I just had to focus on making sure the gas collection and power generation systems work properly. "In that case," I said, feeling a new confidence, "let's start planning." That afternoon, Dr. Williams drove out from Baton Rouge with a trunk full of equipment the university was no longer using. I had a feeling he'd pulled some strings to get it to me, but I wasn't about to question my good fortune. "This flow meter is crucial," he explained, showing me a device that looked like something from a sci-fi movie. "You need to monitor how much gas you're collecting, and at what rate to properly scale the system." Together, we pored over Grandpa's designs, identified components we could build from what we had, and what we'd need to source elsewhere. Dr. Williams made adjustments based on newer technology that hadn't existed when Grandpa was drafting these plans. "Your grandfather was brilliant," he said, shaking his head in admiration. "He was thinking about carbon capture and renewable energy decades before it became mainstream." For the next week, I barely slept. By day, I'd work my shift at Hank's auto shop. By night, I'd be knee-deep in swamp mud, installing pipes and digester tanks. The mosquitoes feasted on me despite the industrial-strength repellent I'd doused myself with. I must have lost 5 pounds in sweat alone. Meanwhile, The parish workers and union volunteers were busy running electrical lines from my property to the clinic and water tower. They brought in poles, transformers, and all the hardware needed, working efficiently with equipment borrowed from the parish maintenance department. A few of them would stop by in the evenings to check on my progress with the biogas system, equal parts skeptical and curious. "Never seen anything like this," one older lineman commented, watching me adjust a pressure valve. "Been working with electricity for 30 years, and here's a kid pulling it out of swamp muck." I took it as a compliment, though I wasn't sure he meant it as one. The first real roadblock came in the form of a man in an expensive-looking shirt with a Southern Electric logo. He showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, wearing loafers that sank into mud in my yard. "I understand you're planning to supply power to municipal infrastructure," he said, not bothering with introductions. "I need to see your permits and engineering certification." I wiped my hands on my jeans and tried to look more confident than I felt. "I'm working with the parish council on an emergency basis. There's people without power for weeks." He gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Son, you need 17 different permits and an energy provider license to power even a traffic light. It's not about the emergency. It's about safety regulations and legal liability." My heart sank. I should have known it wouldn't be this easy. There's always someone with a clipboard ready to shut down anything new or different. "Look, I'm not trying to start a utility company," I argued. "This is temporary assistance during a crisis. Regulations don't have a crisis exemption clause. I'll have to report this to the proper authorities." Fortunately, Sheriff Boudreau and Councilwoman Doucette were quicker on their feet than I was. When I called them about the Southern Electric representative, they arrived within the hour. The councilwoman had a stack of papers and a determined look that made even the company man take a step back. "This is an officially declared emergency situation," she informed him, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We have children without air conditioning in 95-degree Fahrenheit heat. Do you want to be responsible for Mrs. Tompkins's heat stroke, or for the spoiled insulin at the clinic?" The sheriff added his own pressure. "I'm sure your company would hate the headline, 'Southern Electric blocks emergency power to vulnerable residents.'" The representative's smile became strained. "We're simply concerned about safety standards, and Mr. Thibodeau is working under the supervision of Dr. Williams from Louisiana State University's Environmental Engineering Department." Councilwoman Doucette cut in. "I believe that satisfies the safety consultation requirement." After 20 more minutes of bureaucratic fencing, the man reluctantly agreed to a temporary emergency authorization. As he left, I could see him eyeing my setup with a mixture of concern and, unless I was imagining it, grudging curiosity. 3 days later, we flipped the switch, sending power to the water tower pumping station for the first time. A small crowd had gathered. Word travels fast in small communities. When the pump hummed to life and water began flowing through the pipes, a cheer went up from the onlookers. An elderly woman I'd never met pressed a container into my hands. "Real Cajun gumbo," she said with a wink. "Not that tourist nonsense." "You earned it, Cher." The clinic was next. Dr. Martin, who'd been sleeping on a cot in his office to monitor the temperamental backup generator, nearly cried when the lights came on and stayed on. The refrigerator holding vaccines and medication began running smoothly again. "You've saved us," he said simply, gripping my hand with both of his. I felt a strange mix of pride and embarrassment. This wasn't some great innovation I'd invented. It was my grandfather's vision, combined with principles that had been used in other parts of the world for decades. I was just the one who happened to implement it here, in this forgotten corner of Louisiana, where conventional infrastructure had failed. The local paper, the Bayou Chronicle, ran a story with the headline, "Swamp Genius Brings Light to Parish." There was a photo of me standing next to my contraption, looking sweaty and uncomfortable in front of the camera. The reporter had insisted I wear my grandfather's old fishing hat for the picture, said it gave me authentic local character. I felt ridiculous, but went along with it. The article was generally accurate, though it made me sound far more brilliant than I felt. It also mentioned my connection to the Mackenzies as my loving foster family, a description that made me laugh out loud when I read it. But the publicity brought something I hadn't anticipated: environmental concerns. A young woman showed up at my trailer the day after the article was published. She introduced herself as Amelia Bergeron, an environmental science student at LSU. "I need to talk to you about what you're doing to the swamp ecosystem," she said, her expression dead serious. Amelia was passionate, knowledgeable, and initially completely opposed to my project. She had facts and figures about wetland preservation, endangered species habitat disruption, and the delicate balance of the Atchafalaya Basin ecosystem. "Look, I get that you're trying to help people," she said as we walked along the edge of the swamp. "But these wetlands are critical for flood protection, water filtration, and biodiversity. You can't just start extracting elements from the system without consequences." I listened carefully. Growing up with Grandpa Gerald, I developed a deep respect for the swamp. The last thing I wanted was to harm it. "Can I show you something?" I asked when she paused for breath. I led her to a section of the swamp where I hadn't installed any collection pipes. The surface of the water bubbled occasionally as gas naturally escaped into the atmosphere. "That's methane," I explained. "It's being released whether we collect it or not. Actually, it's a worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. By capturing it and burning it for energy, we're converting it to CO2, which is less harmful while getting useful energy in the process." She looked skeptical but interested. "But what about the physical disruption to the environment? Your pipes, your collection tanks?" "That's where I could use your help," I admitted. "I want to do this right. I need someone who understands the ecosystem to help me design a collection system that minimizes impact." Over the next few days, Amelia and I worked together to redesign my collection areas. She showed me which parts of the swamp were critical habitats for rare species and where the most fragile plant communities were located. I adjusted my pipe layouts to avoid these areas completely. We developed what she called a managed collection plan that actually improved parts of the ecosystem. By targeting areas with excessive decomposition that was creating oxygen-poor dead zones, we could help restore healthier water conditions while harvesting energy. It wasn't perfect. Any human intervention changes natural systems, but it was a balance I could live with. And Amelia, to my surprise, became a reluctant advocate for the project. She even brought some of her professors out to see what we were doing. "It's not conventional environmental protection," she explained to them, "but it's practical ecological management that benefits both the natural system and the human community." Her support helped silence some of the critics who had started questioning whether my project would damage the basin's ecosystem. And having experts from the university validate what I was doing gave the whole operation more credibility. Just as things were starting to go smoothly, the Mackenzies showed up. I was giving an interview to a reporter from the local TV station, an uncomfortable experience that had me constantly wiping my sweaty palms on my jeans. When a familiar SUV pulled up, Tom and Bren Mackenzie stepped out, followed by their biological children, all wearing their Sunday best despite the swampy heat. Tom approached with the biggest fake smile I'd ever seen, positioning himself perfectly in frame of the camera. "We always believed in his talent," he exclaimed to the reporter, putting his arm around my shoulders. "Clay's like a son to us, you know. We raised him since he was a little boy." I was too stunned to respond. The reporter, sensing a story angle, asked how they felt about my success. "Oh, we couldn't be prouder," Brenda gushed. "We always encouraged his interest in science. Remember that science fair project in 8th grade, honey? We stayed up all night helping him with that." The truth, they had refused to drive me by materials, and I'd had to bike 5 miles to the hardware store. Grandpa Gerald had helped me with that project, a simple solar water heater that won 3rd place. After the reporter left, the Mackenzies' demeanor changed subtly. The smiles remained, but their eyes told a different story. "We're having some trouble with our electricity," Tom explained, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "The bills are just outrageous this summer with all this heat. We were hoping, since your family and all, you might help us out." I stared at him, memories flooding back. I remembered asking Tom for $40 to buy a graphing calculator for my advanced math class. "Why waste money on something you'll never need?" he'd said, even as he handed his biological son $100 for new basketball shoes. Looking at them now, standing on my property after they'd thrown me out, I didn't feel the triumph I'd imagined. Instead, I felt a strange sort of pity. They'd never been able to see beyond their own backyard. Grandpa used to say, "A person who doesn't believe in the future is already dead." The Mackenzies were alive, but they had never believed in any future beyond the familiar comfort of what they already knew. My rate sheet is posted on the side of the trailer. I told them, keeping my voice level, same rates as everyone else. The look of shock on Tom's face was almost worth everything I had been through. He'd expected special treatment, maybe even free power, from the kid they discarded like yesterday's trash. "Now, listen here," he started, his face reddening. "After everything we did for you, the rate sheet is on the trailer." I repeated, turning away. "You can check it on your way out." That night, as I sat on the porch watching fireflies dance over the swamp, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced since Grandpa died. I was making a difference in people's lives. I was carrying on my grandfather's legacy. And for the first time, I wasn't defined by being that poor orphan boy or the Mackenzie's foster kid. I was Clay Thibodeau, the swamp engineer. The feeling didn't last long. Around midnight, I heard a splash and rustling from the direction of my main collection area. Thinking it might be an alligator getting too curious about the equipment, I grabbed a flashlight and headed out to check. Everything seemed fine at first. The tanks were intact, the gauges showing normal pressure. But as I swept my light across the secondary collection pipes, I noticed something wrong. One of the main lines had been cut, not cleanly like an accident, but jagged, like someone had taken a saw to it. Attached to the damaged pipe was a note, held in place by a hunting knife stuck deep into the PVC. "Sell the land while you can. This isn't your place." I pulled the knife out and examined it. Standard hunting knife, available at any sporting goods store. No distinguishing marks. The note was printed, not handwritten, on regular copy paper. My first thought was that the Mackenzies were behind it, but this felt different. More threatening than their usual passive-aggressive manipulations. This felt professional, like someone was seriously trying to scare me off. I reported the vandalism to Sheriff Boudreau the next morning. He frowned as he examined the damaged pipe and the note. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked, though I could tell he already had some theories. "Could be anyone," I said. "Not everyone is happy about what I'm doing here." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'll have a deputy drive by more often, keep an eye on things. Meanwhile, might be a good idea to set up some cameras, if you can afford it." The sheriff left, but his concern lingered. Who would want to sabotage a project that was helping the community during a crisis? Southern Electric was an obvious suspect. They weren't happy about losing their monopoly, even temporarily. But corporate sabotage seemed extreme, even for them. There were also the land developers who had been eyeing the swamp plan for years. With much of the Gulf Coast eroding away, the slightly higher elevation Atchafalaya Basin properties were becoming more valuable. Grandpa had mentioned offers he received over the years, offers he always declined. As I repaired the damaged pipe, I wondered if someone had decided I'd be easier to intimidate than my grandfather had been. If so, they'd seriously underestimated how stubborn the Thibodeau men could be. That night, I moved my sleeping bag to the porch, a shotgun, another item Grandpa had left me, within arm's reach. I didn't expect trouble, but in the bayou, it's better to be prepared. As the chorus of frogs and insects serenaded me to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated. The swamp held energy that people needed, but it also held secrets that someone wanted to keep buried. And now, for better or worse, both were coming to light. The day after finding the damaged pipe, I drove to the nearest hardware store that sold security equipment. It wasn't cheap, but I invested in 4 weatherproof motion-activated cameras. If someone wanted to mess with my operation, they'd have to show their face to do it. I strategically placed them around the property, focusing on the main collection areas and the approach from the road. I didn't have to wait long. 3 nights later, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert. I grabbed the shotgun and quietly made my way outside, using only the moonlight to guide me. near one of the secondary collection tanks. I caught sight of a figure hunched over, tools in hand. Hands where I can see them. I called out, keeping a safe distance. The figure froze, then slowly stood and turned. In the dim light, I recognized him, Josh McKenzie, Tom and Brenda's son. He was 17, 2 years younger than me. We'd lived under the same roof for years, but had never been close. His parents had made sure of that. His face was a mix of defiance and fear. My dad said this is our swamp, that you stole it. I almost laughed. Your dad kicked me out, remember? And this was my grandfather's land. Now it's mine. Josh glanced at the shotgun. You gonna call the sheriff? I thought about it. I should, probably. But something stopped me. Maybe it was remembering what it was like to be Josh's age, following orders because you didn't see another way. How much is your dad paying you for this? He looked away. Nothing. He just said it was family business. Classic Tom McKenzie, sending his son to do his dirty work for free. But something didn't add up. Josh had never struck me as the type to commit vandalism, even for his father. What's really going on, Josh? There's easier ways to make money than sabotage. He hesitated. Then the words tumbled out. I need money for college. Dad says he won't pay unless I study business at LSU, but I want to do environmental science at Tulane. He says that's for tree huggers. I lowered the shotgun slightly. So you're vandalizing my equipment because... Dad said if I helped convince you to sell the land, he'd split the commission with me. Some developers offering big money for this area. Now things were making sense. Tom wasn't just being petty. There was money involved. Serious money. I made a quick calculation in my head. Then I took a gamble. You know how much I'm making from this swamp? More than you'd make in a month at Burger King. You want real money? Pick up a shovel. Josh looked at me like I'd grown a second head. You're offering me a job? After I try to wreck your stuff? I'm offering you a chance. One-time offer. Take it or I'm calling the sheriff. I wasn't bluffing, and he knew it. The next morning, Josh showed up at 7 a.m. sharp, wearing work boots and looking nervous. I put him to work immediately. The dirtiest, most physically demanding tasks I could find. Digging trenches for new collection pipes, hauling equipment through mud, cleaning filters clogged with swamp gunk. To my surprise, he didn't complain. Not once. By the end of the week, he'd earned his first paycheck. It wasn't huge, but it was his. No strings attached, no family politics involved. What did your dad say when you told him you're working for me? I asked. Josh grinned. I didn't. Told him I got a job with a landscaping company. As word spread about my successful power system, more local residents started asking if they could connect to my grid. The parish's temporary authorization only covered emergency services, but people were desperate for reliable electricity. After the third hurricane season in 5 years had devastated the conventional power infrastructure, folks were willing to try anything. I realized I needed to go legitimate. Permits, business license, insurance, the works. With help from Dr. Williams and Councilwoman Doucette, I navigated the bureaucratic maze to officially register Cajun Clean Energy as a legal entity. It wasn't easy. The paperwork alone nearly buried me, and the fees ate into my modest savings. But becoming official opened doors I hadn't anticipated. There's a state grant program for renewable energy development in hurricane-vulnerable zones. Dr. Williams told me one evening, sliding a printout across my kitchen table. The deadline's next week. I think you should apply. The grant application process was grueling. I spent days compiling data on my system's output, efficiency, and scalability. Amelia helped me with the environmental impact section, which turned out to be our strongest selling point. Unlike conventional power plants, my system actually reduced methane emissions while providing electricity. When the approval letter came, I had to read it 3 times to believe it. $200,000 in development funds. It might as well have been $1 million to me. Suddenly, all those dreams of expansion weren't just dreams anymore. I hired Josh full-time and brought on 2 more local guys who had been laid off when the paper mill closed during the 2008 recession. Many folks around here had been forced into the oil industry after the economic crash. only to suffer again when oil prices collapsed. Working for Cajun Clean Energy meant stable employment that didn't depend on global oil markets. With the grant money, we were able to properly scale up the operation. Better equipment, more collection points, higher capacity generators. We even built a small office at the edge of the property. Nothing fancy, just a simple structure where we could keep the business side of things separated from my living space. Our first real test came when Southern Electric sent a representative, a different one this time, wearing an expensive suit despite the humid weather. He introduced himself as a senior acquisitions manager. "We've been monitoring your operation with interest," he said, seated at my new desk like he owned it. "It's an impressive science project for someone with no formal engineering training." I waited for the real reason he was there. It didn't take long. "Southern Electric would like to acquire your technology patents. We're prepared to offer you a fair sum and, perhaps, a scholarship to the technical college of your choice. It's a win-win. You get your education, and we integrate your innovation into our broader infrastructure." The offer he slid across the desk was for $500,000. For everything, the technology, the patents, the business, a fraction of what was worth, especially considering the federal grant I'd already received was nearly half that amount. "This is an interesting science project," he said with a condescending smile, "but developing energy infrastructure requires resources only a major utility can provide. Why not let the professionals handle it while you go to college?" I'd expected something like this would happen eventually. Dr. Williams had warned me that if my system proved successful, bigger players would come sniffing around. Fortunately, he'd also helped me prepare. "I appreciate your interest," I said, sliding the offer back untouched. "But I've already filed patents with the help of Louisiana State University's engineering department, and we've secured development funding from both state and federal renewable energy programs." The man's smile faltered. He clearly hadn't expected me to be so prepared. Perhaps you misunderstand the opportunity here. Southern Electric could make things very difficult for an unauthorized utility provider. "We're fully authorized," I replied, pulling out the permits Councilwoman Doucette had helped fast-track. "And as of last month, we're a recognized provider under the Louisiana Rural Electrification Initiative." It was a bluff. We were still in the application process for that program, but he didn't know that. He left with a tight smile and a promise to be in touch. I had no doubt they'd try again with a different approach. As our operation grew, I started approaching other swamp landowners in the area. Many of them owned parcels similar to mine, land that had been in their family for generations but was considered essentially worthless. "Your swamp can generate income without selling it to developers," I explained to Mrs. Thibodeau, no relation, despite the shared name, an elderly woman who owned 30 acres adjacent to my property. "We install the collection system, maintain it, and you get a percentage of the revenue." She eyed me suspiciously. "What's the catch?" "No catch. You've been cursing this land your whole life. Now to pay you back." Within 6 months, we had expanded our collection network across 5 neighboring properties, creating a mini-grid that served over 60 homes and businesses in the southern part of the parish. Each landowner received quarterly payments based on the gas collected from their property. Through all of this, Amelia became an increasingly important part of both the business and my life. What started as professional cooperation, she monitored the environmental impact of our operations, evolved into something more personal. We spent countless evenings on my porch, discussing expansion plans and sustainability metrics, which somehow always led to deeper conversations about life, family, and our hopes for the future. She understood my drive to prove the Mackenzies wrong without me having to explain it, and I admire her fierce commitment to protecting the wetlands while still recognizing that people needed sustainable solutions to live. "Most environmentalists and business people see each other as enemies," she told me one night as we watched heat lightning dance over swamp. But that's a false choice. The best solutions work for both people and the planet. Josh, meanwhile, had become my right-hand man. He had a natural talent for the technical aspect of the operation and had even suggested several improvements to the collection system that increased efficiency by nearly 20%. More importantly, he seemed to be finding his own path, separate from his father's expectations. I always hated how my dad treated you, he admitted one day as we were repairing a filter system. But I was afraid I'd end up in your place if I said anything. Your dad's good at making people feel small. I agreed. Makes him feel bigger, I guess. He's still telling everyone that your success is because of how they raised you. Josh shook his head. It's like he lives in a different reality. Maybe he does, I said, but we don't have to live there with him. As Cajun Clean Energy grew, I found myself with something I'd never had before, disposable income. My first major personal purchase was renovating Grandpa Gerald's trailer. I replaced a leaky roof, installed proper insulation, and upgraded the ancient plumbing system that had been limping along for decades. It was still the same humble home, but now it was weatherproof, energy efficient, and comfortable year-round. But as my bank account grew, so did my thoughts about what to do with the money. The memory of struggling on my own after aging out of foster care was still fresh. I remember the panic of having nowhere to go, no safety net, no guidance for navigating adult life. It wasn't just about the Mackenzies throwing me out. It was about a system that left kids like me unprepared and unsupported at a critical time. After some research and conversations with Amelia about it, I decided to establish the Gerald Thibodeau Memorial Fund for Louisiana foster youth. No kid should feel unwanted or thrown away, I told the attorney who helped set up the foundation. Like I did. The fund would provide scholarships and emergency support for kids aging out of the foster system, helping with college applications, first apartments, professional clothing for job interviews. All the things I'd had to figure out on my own. It was a small start, funded mostly from my own pocket, but it felt right. Grandpa Gerald had always taught me that true wealth came from what you gave, not what you kept. The weather in Louisiana has always been dramatic, but climate change has made hurricane season increasingly unpredictable and severe. 3 years after I started Cajun Clean Energy, Hurricane Marcus slammed into the Gulf Coast, Category 4, with sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and a storm surge that flooded coastal communities for miles inland. The conventional power grid collapsed. Again, over 70% of the state lost electricity, with estimates of 3 to 6 weeks for full restoration. But not our customers. The Cajun Clean Energy microgrid continued functioning through the worst of the storm. We lost some collection points to flooding, but the modular design meant the system as a whole kept working. While surrounding areas went dark, our 60-plus connected homes and businesses maintained power for refrigeration, medical equipment, and communication. News traveled fast. CNN sent a crew. Fox News followed. Suddenly, my swamp wasn't just a local curiosity. It was a national story about resilience and innovation in the face of increasingly frequent climate disasters. A week after the hurricane, a government SUV pulled up to our office. A woman in a FEMA jacket introduced herself as Regional Director Martinez. "We've been following your operation with great interest, Mr. Thibodeau," she said, surveying our setup with professional curiosity, particularly how it performed during Hurricane Marcus. She got straight to the point. FEMA is looking for sustainable backup power solutions for critical infrastructure in hurricane-prone regions. We like to discuss implementing your technology in 5 coastal states as part of our disaster preparedness initiative. It was surreal, like something from a movie, not my life. This swamp, which everyone had dismissed as worthless, which had been given to me as some kind of joke inheritance, was now attracting attention from federal agencies. That evening, after the FEMA officials left with promises of follow-up meetings, I sat alone in Grandpa's, my trailer, trying to process everything. 3 years ago, I'd been sleeping in my car after being kicked out by the Mackenzies. Now I was discussing multi-state contracts with the federal government. Seeking some grounding, I pulled out one of Grandpa Gerald's old Cajun cookbooks. He'd used to make the best gumbo I'd ever tasted, and I'd been meaning to try recreating it. As I flipped through the dog-eared pages, a folded note fell out. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting immediately. The cypress tree has strong roots because it grows in the swamp. So, do you? Now build something truly great. The note was dated just a week before he died. He'd known all along what I could do with this land. He'd seen the potential not just in the swamp, but in me, when no one else had. Outside, the swamp hummed with life. Insects chirped, frogs croaked, and somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowed. The collection tanks gathered energy from decay, transforming what others saw as waste into power and possibility. I thought about the long journey from that first day when I'd stood on this property, newly orphaned again after Mackenzie's threw me out, staring at a worthless inheritance, about how Grandpa Gerald's faith in me had outlived him, providing a foundation when I needed it most. The cypress trees around the property stood tall and strong, their roots buried deep in the muck and water. They didn't fight the swamp. They thrived because of it. And now, so was I. Tomorrow would bring meetings with FEMA officials, calls with potential investors, and 1,000 tasks of running a growing enterprise. But tonight, I sat with my grandfather's note, in the home he'd left me, surrounded by the swamp that had changed everything. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what people think. Sometimes it's hidden beneath the surface, waiting for someone with the right eyes to see it. 3 years later, Cajun Clean Energy had transformed from a single trailer into a complex of biogas processing facilities. Sitting on the roof of our new office building, watching marsh birds build nests on the special platforms we'd installed, I could almost feel Grandpa Gerald chuckling somewhere nearby. Not because his grandson had become a millionaire at 22, but because I'd proven what he always believed. The greatest treasure often hides where no one bothers to look. The sun was setting over the Atchafalaya Basin, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reflected off the collection tanks and solar panels that now dotted the property. What had once been dismissed as worthless swampland had become a model of sustainable energy innovation. Our success didn't go unnoticed. After the FEMA partnership launched, requests for consultation poured in from similar regions, from Florida's Everglades to the Sundarbans in Bangladesh. Communities with abundant wetlands but limited access to reliable power wanted to replicate our model. We created something that worked not despite the swamp, but because of it. With the business thriving, I launched the Marshland to Mainland Scholarship Program for gifted kids from low-income families in foster care. The program didn't just provide money for college. It included mentorship, internship opportunities, and housing assistance. Everything I wished I'd had when starting out. Josh was our first success story. He graduated with honors from Tulane's environmental science program and came back to work as our lead sustainability engineer. His father never did find out where his college tuition really came from. Grandpa Gerald's old trailer remained on the property, though I'd moved into a modest house nearby. Instead of tearing it down, I transformed it into a small museum where we conducted tours for school children. This is where it all started. I would tell the wide-eyed kids, with one person believing in the value of something everyone else thought was useless. The trailer contained Grandpa's original equipment, his journals, and photos documenting the evolution of Cajun Clean Energy. The children's favorite exhibit was the interactive model showing how swamp gas formed and could be harvested for energy. Mine was a wall of letters from people whose lives had changed because they finally had reliable power. Our research team, led by Amelia, developed a new technology that didn't just collect methane, but also help restore degraded wetlands. Louisiana has been losing coastal land at an alarming rate. Football fields of land disappearing into the Gulf every day. Our collection systems, it turned out, could stabilize soil and promote new growth when installed correctly. We're not just preventing a greenhouse gas from entering the atmosphere. Amelia explained to a documentary crew from HBO, we're creating a reason to preserve these ecosystems instead of draining them for development. The documentary, titled Swamp Kid, followed my journey from orphan teenager to renewable energy pioneer. When it received an Emmy nomination, the producer called to tell me the news. They want you at the ceremony in Los Angeles, he said excitedly. I declined. We were in the middle of installing a new collection grid, and I didn't want to leave my team shorthanded. Some things are more important than awards. A week before my 23rd birthday, Hurricane Eliza formed in the Gulf. Within days, it intensified to a Category 5, with Louisiana directly in its path. Meteorologists called it a storm of the century, with potential to be worse than Katrina. The governor ordered mandatory evacuations for coastal parishes. Most of our employees packed up and headed north, as they should have. But someone needed to stay behind to secure the collection system. If damaged, the methane could leak or, worse, ignite. I'm staying. I told Amelia as we helped the last of our team evacuate. Then I'm staying too, she replied, her expression leaving no room for argument. Josh was the last to leave the property. He hesitated at his truck. You sure you don't want me to stay and help? I shook my head. Get your family somewhere safe. We've got this. That night was the darkest I'd ever experienced. The power went out across the region around 8 p.m. By midnight, the wind was howling so fiercely it sounded like freight trains circling the building. Rain lashed against the windows with such force I thought they might shatter. Around 2 a.m., the emergency monitoring system showed pressure building in one of the main collection lines. If it blew, it could trigger a chain reaction to the entire system. We have to get out there, I shouted over the storm to Amelia. You're insane, she shouted back. But she was already pulling on her rain gear. In the storage closet, searching for flashlights, I found an old metal box that had belonged to Grandpa Gerald. Inside was his ancient emergency light, the kind you crank by hand to generate power. I gave a few turns, and miraculously, it still worked. The journey to the main collection area, normally a 5-minute walk, took nearly 30 minutes as we fought against hurricane-force winds. The rain felt like needles against any exposed skin. Twice we had to drop to the ground to avoid flying debris. When we reached the main valve, the pressure gauge was in the red zone. Working together, soaked to bone and battling the wind, we managed to release the pressure gradually through the emergency venting system. It took nearly an hour of precise adjustments, but finally, the gauge dropped back to safe levels. As we made our way back to the building, exhausted and drenched, Amelia grabbed my arm and pointed. Through the driving rain, I could see one of our biogas generators was still running, its light a lonely beacon in the storm-ravaged darkness. Grandpa's design had held. While the conventional power grid had failed completely, our system, adapted to the harsh realities of swamp life, was still functioning in areas protected from the worst of the wind. By morning, the storm had passed. The devastation was immense. Trees down everywhere, buildings damaged, roads flooded. But our core infrastructure had survived, and the safety systems had prevented any catastrophic failures. More importantly, we still had power. Within hours, we became an impromptu community center. People arrived seeking to charge phones to contact loved ones, refrigerate medications, or just find a dry place with lights and air conditioning. The local hospital, running on failing backup generators, reached out. Could we help power their critical care units? Using our emergency protocols, we managed to establish a connection that kept their ventilators and other essential equipment running. 2 days later, a CNN crew arrived by helicopter, astonished to find a functioning power source in the disaster zone. The reporter looked genuinely stunned as she conducted her interview. "What would you say to the people who once laughed at you in this worthless land?" she asked. I thought about it for a moment, remembering Tom McKenzie's dismissive comments, the Southern Electric executive's condescension, all the people who couldn't see beyond the mud and mosquitoes. "Thank you for not seeing value in what I love," I said, looking directly into the camera. It meant I could transform it into something meaningful. Every swamp is a potential source of life, just like every person if given a chance. The clip went viral. Within days, calls came from the Department of Energy, the Pentagon, even the White House. Everyone wanted to know how a small company in the Louisiana bayou had created a power system resilient enough to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. A month later, we held the official opening of our new research center, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to wetland energy systems and coastal restoration. The governor cut the ribbon. University presidents spoke about partnerships. But what surprised me most was seeing the McKenzies in the crowd. After the ceremony, Tom approached me awkwardly, his wife and kids hanging back. He looked older, grayer, and somehow smaller than I remembered. I just want to say I'm proud of you," he said, extending his hand. I hesitated only briefly before shaking it. "My home is always open to you," I replied, emphasizing the word my. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement of the past and of how far we'd both come since then. On my 23rd birthday, a package arrived from Grandpa Gerald's old lawyer. The envelope had specific instructions to deliver it only after I had found my purpose, whatever that meant. I guess the lawyer had been following my story. Inside was a photograph of young Gerald with his wife and a baby, my father, standing on the edge of the very same swamp. On the back, in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, "Now you know the truth. This land was never nobody's. It always belonged to you, because you're the only one who truly understood it, just like I once did." That evening, I stood on Grandpa's old dock, watching the sun set over the swamp. The collection systems hummed quietly in the background, harvesting energy from decay. New growth sprouted around the pipes and tanks, evidence of Amelia's restoration work. In the distance, the lights of our facility glowed, providing power to thousands of homes that once went dark with every storm. Amelia joined me on the dock, wrapping her arms around my waist from behind. I showed her Grandpa's note and photograph. "Strange," I said, as we watched an egret glide silently over the water. "I had to lose everything to find something truly valuable." She rested her head against my shoulder. Maybe that's how it always works. We don't appreciate what we have until it's gone, or what we could have until we fight for it. The swamp stretched before us, teeming with life and possibility. No longer a wasteland, but the foundation of everything I'd built. Not just a business, but a home, a purpose, a legacy. From worthless inheritance to empire, built on the simple idea that value exists where people bother to look for it. Grandpa Gerald had known it all along. And now, so did I.